Hello and welcome. Today we are making blue steel look as good as possible, as fast as possible. We're adding paint, wash, glaze, and contrast, and all of the above to see which is the best way to take any silver metallic. These are all kind of at the end stages apart from the paint. You just finish your model and then drop a wash on, drop a glaze on, drop a contrast on, whatever it is, do a final dry brush. So you can do this after something's been painted. And we're seeing which is the fastest way to tint your metallics, whatever color you like. It doesn't have to be blue, it can be absolutely anything. I'm using the Leo Game Air Silver. I think this is incredible. And if I do gold, I tend to use Retributor Armor. So if any of you have kind of go-to paints, amazing products or techniques or methods or step-by-steps, then please do let us know below. I'll pin them and I'll put them in the pinned comment. That's it. Let's jump in. Let's see how this goes. First up, we have the contrast Leviadon blue. Now this is a beast. All of the contrasts have completely different traits. You can see here, I'm putting it over the silver on my palette, tongue twister. I'm doing that on purpose. I want to be able to see exactly how it's going to behave on my silver model. So why wouldn't I test it on the silver part of my palette? I'm gonna put in some lamy medium here. You can use contrast medium, just any medium is fine. So I've used this to kind of just bulk it out a little bit, stop it from being quite so intense, and we're going to wash it all over our model. Now, depending how heavily you've used this, how heavily you've diluted it, you're going to get a completely different effect. So what I'm doing here is just looking to coax it into every single area. We're going for all over coverage, and then kind of importantly, any areas like this where we've got pooling, I'm just going to use my brush as a sponge, take off some excess, put it elsewhere, and you can also add it back. So if I want to add that, kind of fill it in, that lightning bolt or the anvil, that is completely within our control too. A wash isn't just, it's not like, oh, it's there, that's it. You can control exactly how it behaves. Be mindful of which way you're leaving it to dry as well, which way you're holding it, the orientation, that'll make a really big difference. Now, sometimes with metallics, you can end up with a coat which paint kind of wants to shy away from. It's a slightly shiny coat. Just be patient, you just got to kind of get over that surface tension, and then once you're there, you'll be absolutely fine. I'm going to leave this to dry like this because I don't want to encourage any specific pulling towards the bottom because it looks unnatural. I'd rather have it pulling towards the edges and give me some incidental shading. Next, we have a glaze. I'm using Guilliman blue, but you could use any glaze from anyone else. Now, glazes behave more like inks. They're not made to pull in the same way, but actually the kind of the phrasing with these gets mixed up, and what really matters is the potency. So I'm using Guilliman, it's got a lovely color. You can already see we can actually expect some more transparency there. And I know this because I'm testing it on my palette. I know exactly what's gonna go on my model because I've tested it here. I'm pretty much gonna use this in exactly the same way. All of what I'm saying is viable for all the techniques, whether you're using a glaze or a wash or a paint or a contrast or anything like that. You can achieve what you want in various ways. You can do one thick version, one thick coat. Obviously, that's not a particularly popular phrase and potentially for good reason. Or you can do multiple thin coats, which is definitely far more of a popular approach and probably, generally speaking, a better idea as well. So I've popped the glaze on here. You can see if I go and snag the other one, it's been much more subtle. It's left it much more blue. This one looks more angelic. This one looks more weathered. This one went over a slightly lighter shield, which is a trait as well, but this is probably going to need a couple of coats. So we're done, and this looks awful. Why does it look awful? Now, the reason for this is glazes are meant to be used super thin. So a glaze is meant to be, think of it as a filter. You're going to put a very thin layer all over the area in question. It's not going to vary in thickness. You're not looking for pooling. You're not looking for anything like that. You can bring it up against ridges and stuff, but you've got these potential downsides if you do take that approach. So thin, consistent layers all over. Some glazes are stronger than others. Make sure it's properly shaken, all of that jazz. Now we're going to try and, well, we've got these mistakes there we're going to ignore those for now, and I'm going to show you what happens over the course of a couple of layers. Probably 2 or 3 is what's required, although it's completely up to you, and it depends on the strength of the glaze. You can use inks to make your own, you can use paints to make your own. They have the same attributes. Unless it is kind of bound in a medium, you are at risk of getting tidal marks, so use them thin, be careful, take your time, do a couple of coats. Okay, that's done. So it's pretty striking, but I am not a fan of the overall quality. We will touch on how to repair that, completely remedy it at the end of the video, and this is a technique that you can use on any mistakes on metallics in the kind of final highlighting stage, which really fixes any of those issues. So we're moving on to Drakenhof Nightshade. Now, I've actually mixed Drakenhof Nightshade and the contrast Leviadon blue here on my palette. They're very similar. The contrast tends to be a little bit more vibrant, at least in this one in particular. Now I've got the shade here, I'm going to pretty much use it neat, and just as I did with the contrast, I'm going to take my time. I'm happy to do a couple of coats of this. With all of these techniques, the paints will land better over themselves. And what I mean by that is, if you've got a naked metallic shield and you're putting whatever on it, a contrast, a glaze, a shade, it wants to go over itself more. A dry, solid, like consistent coat of itself. So the first pass sometimes is just a way to prime your surface ready for the second pass, and you might find that on the second pass in particular, things behave a lot more to your liking. Second coat time. Now for a Brucey bonus, because I wanted to show you kind of what you can do if you're being subtle with contrast paints, this is what happens if you don't dilute contrast paints. So we've gone in here, pure Leviadon blue. We're going to have to put in a great deal of effort to make sure it doesn't absolutely obliterate everything we've got underneath it. Even though we've got fairly bright, punchy silver, I'm going to make sure that we avoid pooling as much as possible, and there is an absolute minimum over that. It's going to filter it way more than a super strong ink, and it's going to pool in the recesses. It's more viscous. Okay, so once I've done a first pass, I'll go around and then anywhere where I want to remove excess from or take excess to, or kind of encourage pooling, I can control. It's all the same techniques no matter the material. Make sure we don't miss anywhere. So contrast, of course, is literally made for this type of use. That is the fastest way to get that effect available to you, and therefore it's the most efficient. Also, because it's made to be used like this, if we hop over to the Glaze, which has got a really different, interesting, it's not a worse effect, it's just a different one. This is made to be used like that, so we'll give you kind of less imperfections within the layers of what you've done. So what happens if we mix it? Well, if only we had a super shiny shield ready for trying out. What happens if we mix these 3 fairly similar in principle different types of painting product? Okay, we've got our contrast here on a palette. Let's take a generous blob of Drakenhof Nightshade, put it in. Now that's going to dilute it. It is less potent. Everything we add to this is going to dilute it. It's like adding mixers to a cocktail. I'll put in some Guilliman blue, why not? That's going to lighten it and soften it at the same time. And let's see where we end up here. Now we've got an area that we can test it on. Looks kind of cool. Bearing in mind that this is a shiny metal base coat, so it may repel our paint. It should push it very aggressively towards the recesses. I've never tested this, but what I'm hoping it will do is show that combining these paints is a really good idea, and you can achieve a hybrid of all of their traits, whether that's color, coverage, speed, efficiency, all that type of stuff. You can achieve a hybrid of them fairly efficiently. So not looking to let it pull anywhere, being careful of the direction of my brush strokes, taking it to the very edges, and then as we touched on, we can pick on some details and make sure that we hit them a little bit harder. So that actually is my favorite result so far. That's pretty much what I was hoping for. I've not gone in using any like specific principles or ratios or anything like that, but what I've worked with is the fact that that is incredibly strong, that will dilute it, and it is a medium. It's not water, so it's not going to change the behavior, the personality traits of it as much as adding water, which is completely different wood. That's made with a medium. And then we've gone in with a glaze, which is the closest thing we've got to water in this mix. And actually what that's done is it's added a little bit of that lovely bright blue, which kind of, we like the idea of here, but we didn't like the traits of here. Now you could drop in ink and you could get the same result as I've had from adding the glaze, or you can mix in some paint. There is absolutely nothing wrong with that whatsoever. So we've hit our whatever it is with as many coats of whatever we are deciding to use. How do we bring it back into the metallic spectrum? Unless what you put down is either transparent and glossy or actually metallic itself, you are going to make this less shiny. Now that is not a negative at all in my opinion, because that means you can get a contrast of how metallic the finish is on your final coats, your highlights, your final dry brushes. You can airbrush it again, whatever it is. You've got a less metallic kind of recess section here, and that means that you can unlock some super contrasted highlights, which is only a bonus, I think. So and grab some of our super potent silver. I'll remove a load of it off the brush. We're just looking to catch edges here. We can see how it's catching the edges of the texture palette. Looks about right. Give it a twist. We don't want any kind of drifts or dent sections in there. And then softly at first, you can see holding it towards the back, loose grip. We're going to come at our model. Now what I'm doing here is I'm concentrating on the edges for now while I learn how much is going to be coming off the brush. I'm also keeping to roughly a 45-degree angle. Doesn't matter from which side. I'll try and do it from both, but I'm trying to go down the edges, pick them out specifically, and then at the point at which I know exactly how the brush is behaving, I'll bring it into the middle and I'll carefully buff this up. You could keep it directional, like I'm going there, top to bottom. Now what this is going to do is it's going to do a couple of things. It's going to highlight your edges. It's going to highlight any other ridges within there. So even on your base coat, there'll be some little ripples or stuff like that. You can see got a slight texture here. Even just from the primer can, it pick those up, but it will also hide a multitude of sins in your previous coat. So those bits that weren't completely perfect, they are now way, way, way less noticeable. And then it's up to you how far you want to go with this. So I'm just going to buff this until I'm happy with it, basically. You can take a little bit of your previous coat, mix it in with your metal and let that tint it. So if you want this to still be blue, whatever you've used, you can pull that into your silver paint. Nothing wrong with that. Don't be afraid of it because it's a metallic paint mixing in with another paint or anything like that. You can tint this however you like. Okay, so that was our worst shield of the bunch in my opinion. Looks pretty awesome now. All right, we're going to take exactly the same approach with our one that's had the wash. I've not even added more paint to this brush. Let's see how we can go with it. I can be more aggressive now. I know exactly how it's going to behave and we can buff this up. What this should end up is looking like a pretty kind of well-worn shield with quite a lot of depth to it. Because less metallics are leaving my brush, we'll keep more of the personality of the previous layers, and it was a bit darker anyway as a result of the colors that we've used. So there we go, we've got a just off blue steel. Now I want to show you what would happen if I were to mix in a little blue to my metallics. Take a little bit here, work it into the brush. Basically, I'm just putting down a slightly cooler silver. It's going to darken it. It's not a negative, but there's no adverse effects there. So you can add whatever you like into that. Really want to stress that. So moving on to our Leviadon blue. I haven't added any silver to the brush yet. I've just used the dampening pad. So let's see how much leaves. I'd like to have 3 of completely different kind of final effects. This looks kind of aquatic, deep blue. As you can see here, I'm not going back for more paint. I'm going back for more moisture. That's going to help the paint exit. I don't want the brush to be wet. I've only got 1 drop of water in there. And then patiently, I'm just kind of buffing it up. And as a result, we'll get a smooth, smooth, smooth result. We've just diluted it here, and just like you dilute normal layer paints to achieve a smoother result, exactly the same goes for dry brushing. It's an unhelpful name, almost, dry brushing. It's not about drying your brush out. That's old school. We're going for new school, high quality, shiny, easy as well. Like, impossible to go wrong with that. And it's looking really shiny. Silly thing to say about metallics, but because the base coat has lost its sheen, the stuff that's on top stands out all the more just because it's brighter. It's going to reflect more. Last but not least, I can't say anything today, we are going for our hybrid. So I am going to use some more of the paint here. I'm not just using what's left in the brush. Pretty light. And just like I did with the first one, keeps the edges initially. See what that leads us to. And then I'm going to buff the entire thing. I just want this to be global. I'm not looking for a light source. I don't want it more shiny from above. I just want this thing to look like blue steel in general. There we go. So altogether, we're going to notice the huge amount of variety we can get between those, and it's just a matter of how heavy we go, what we use, how transparent it is, how many layers, etc. All right, there we go. So our contrast, I hope I got this right, I have, contrast and our wash have ended up very similar. Like I said, they're very similar tones, so that's going to be part of it, but also we did a couple layers of the wash and the contrast was thick, so even like 3 layers of the wash and 1 layer of the contrast could pretty much lead to the end result. So therefore, picking that one would be a more efficient way to do it. Our glaze has turned out super interestingly. We fixed all those issues we had, or kind of diverted attention from them at least. And then this has turned out really well. That's our hybrid, that's everything mixed together. The ratio was probably 2 contrast to 2 wash to 4 glaze, about. I realized I could have said 1, 1, 2 there, maths peeps. That's what I get for trying to think of things on the fly. And then we've done the same kind of global dry brush afterwards. How you do the dry brush makes a really big difference, and also the color of the dry brush. So you could mix black in with this, you could use a darker metallic, you could use a blue metallic, you can mix a blue in with it. All of those are completely open up to you, and there's just a variety of results here at your disposal. What I'm going to do is I'm going to grab one of these shields, I'm going to contrast it with my typical mix of rusty paints, and because we've got a cool recess already, we should get a lovely cool to warm contrast there, and for the time we've put into it, we should get an absolutely amazing end result. We're going to rock it through these colours in this order: Doomball, Scrag, Troll Slayer, Fire Dragon. You could use not these colours, this is just kind of my preferred method with GWs. You can use Vallejo, whatever you've got at your disposal. And essentially what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be diluting my first stages but using them more heavily, and then with slightly less dilute paint I'll be more specific as I go on and put them in ever increasing area on the model. So just to give an idea with the first paint, again putting it on the silver part of my palette, therefore I know how it is going to look on my model exactly, not guessing, but I know literally exactly how it will look on the model. As I said, we just shrunk the area where I've done the highlights. I've also, with the successive highlights, I've done them, whereas the first stages I did everywhere, all the recesses, all the kind of joining points between 2 parts. As I got towards the brighter colours, I put them only on areas that they were facing upwards. So on the top of these, but not on the underside, for example, on the top of the hammer, but not on the underside, that type of stuff. So I've got the same brush that I used for my highlights for the previous stuff. Again, gone to the dampening pad, not gone to the palette yet. And then we're just going to use this to make sure those shiny bits remain shiny. Up to you how heavy you do this. For me, that is done. I think that looks brilliant. Love a cool warm contrast, and this is one of my kind of TM ways to go about things. Obviously, if you put it on a shield this blue, you would get nuts contrast, like crazy. So there we go. I thought I would show you what happens if you put the paint in. On my palette, I have Huldra Blue, I have Vallejo 950 Matte Black, and I have Vallejo Game Air Silver. I'm going to take a little of this, pull it into the middle, little blue. It is a potent blue, and then a small amount of the black. There we go. And I'm going to go for kind of all over coverage with this. Now, because we've got a black in there which covers well, we've got a blue in there that's deep and strong, and we've got a silver that has kind of God-given coverage in the Vallejo Game Air Silver. That is all we need to do for a base coat. The next stage, I've worked off the excess off my brush, and I'm going to go use the dampening pad as well. Let's get rid of a lot of that black. Now obviously, because we've added non-metallic paints to our metallic paint, that is going to dilute it in terms of how metallic it is. It is so heavily pigmented though and shiny that I think it's absolutely fine. So I've just got the blue now. Take a little more. Work off the excess. And then just as we've approached it with our others, gently bring that up to where we want it. This will end up kind of in the blue steel spectrum. Unless you use a massive amount, whatever you do is going to look fairly subtle. You're probably going to end up tinting it. Try and get a bit more of the blue in there. There we go. And then it's basically a matter of just working your way up slightly brighter by adding more of your silver. All right, we are done. So they turned out amazingly. Hopefully you've kind of picked up on all of the information to be gleaned from my testing these out. The really important things to bear in mind are coverage and viscosity. By viscosity, I mean the thickness of your paint. So whether something's more like water and is thin or more like oil and is thick. The contrasts and shades are more gloopy, the glazes are more watery. So coverage, if you've got a really potent color, and this varies completely across the ranges. I used Leviadon blue. If I were to use achromatic blue, this is so weak. This is so weak. It's a lovely color, but it's incredibly weak. That would have barely shown up. It would have just subtly tinted what we did, even though it is a contrast paint. So they don't all have the same traits at all. You need to know which one is as strong as it is, and that's why it's important to test on your palette. Like I said, think of it of making like a cocktail with a mix. If you've got a really strong spirit and you add anything to it, you're going to dilute it. If you've got really strong Leviadon blue, if you add anything to that apart from pure ink, it's going to get less opaque and more transparent. So that's something to bear in mind. And that's why when we combine them all together, we ended up with quite a nice combination of personality traits. We've got the lovely magical blue from the glaze. We got the kind of dilution from the shade, and then we got the super potent coverage. We dialed that back a bit from the contrast, and together they worked really well. Mixing the paint in works really well, and overall the final effect is really good. So don't be afraid to mix them, and with a couple of rules in mind, you can go into the mixing with kind of less worry. So one thing to bear in mind, the mistakes that I made that I showed you in the middle of the video with the glaze, that is going to happen more with that type of product. So the shades, the contrast, they're a little bit more forgiving. Dilute your water with a medium rather than with water, sorry. And that'll just help give you nice smooth transitions. Also maybe shy away from using a hairdryer because that can encourage things to get tidal marks at the edges, but do make sure that whatever you do, your layers are fully dry before going on to the next one, because it's quite easy to think it's dry, especially if it's over a shiny metallic base, and then to pull it off. You can fix it, but obviously it's better to not make those mistakes in the first place. All of those look great. They're just kind of different takes on the same idea, really solid end results. Obviously if you're painting Grey Knights, you've got like 5 things to choose from there. All of them would look really good, but just think about how dark you want your shadows to be, how much contrast you want there to be, how blue you want it in this case, but how green, how pink, how magenta, how whatever, and they'll kind of inform your decision. You can put washes in the middle of the process, you can put them on the very end, even after a final highlight, you could put a little glaze over that. So whatever effect you're going for, there is something out there, and you could do this over the top of silver, you can do it underneath silver, really doesn't matter, but kind of as I've shown you, you can go start to finish with silver and then just do a couple of stages of whatever, and then at the final end, do a dry brush, and you can get away with absolute murder. So these are all amazing ways to paint an army, and a little bit of weathering, especially on top of this, some nice contrasting other colors, some red robes or something like that, and you're on to an absolute winner. I will put up a picture now of a kind of high-level model that I painted using these techniques, and the weathering, it turned out really well, my Stormcast character, and that's what you can do if you want to take them to the next level. So I just did more stages of dry brushing, more stages of washing. That's it basically. All right, well, I hope you've really liked this video. I hope it's been useful and informative. Please give it a like, please comment, please subscribe, put your suggestions down below, whether they are for future videos or for ways that you paint your metallics. I'd love to see them. We'll catch you in the next video.